think this will be a good way to start the day, kind of like macro mixing concepts and production mindset. I'm going to go through a little bit of one of my own projects and just show what I'm talking about in that context. I know some of you I was talking to yesterday were interested in, just like more hands-on ways to create space for elements in your mix, like setting what that is going to be and getting more clarity in your mixes. And so we'll be touching on a little bit of that. And obviously, thanks again to Dan for setting all this up. Thank you to Ableton. Just very humbled to be here with you guys. And yeah, I would also kind of encourage you guys to sort of cherry pick this and take the best parts of what you learn through this and integrate that into your process as it is now. If there are things that you've found great results with at this point, by no means am I the end all be all of what is going to be like objectively better for you or not. So I think that there's like going to be something in here for you, but I'm going to kind of go at this from my personal approach and an approach that I think a lot of people are. I think I'm in the same boat of a lot of people as like I don't have like a big well-furnished studio. I mean, I have monitors, but I'm in like a 500 square foot apartment in Denver. I got rid of all my things before I moved there. And I make a majority of my music on my couch, in my headphones. I know those headphones really well. I've listened to a lot of different types of music on there, made a lot of mixes on there. And it just kind of goes to show that if you know your equipment and you reference on a lot of different, types of playback systems, like you don't need a treated room to get a good quality mix. I just had to throw him on here. I don't know. It just felt wholesome and good. And the whole weekend has been so wholesome so far. So welcome. Yeah, exactly. You can't tell, but he's got ears, So yeah, micro goals just for this particular presentation. Hopefully you can go into your own tracks and be a little bit more intentional with the choices you're making, both like compositionally and mixing wise. I think that, you'll get at least one new perspective on the process through this. Hopefully it'll help you make more balanced tunes and just have an overall understanding of like how things are placed in the mix so that they'll complement one another. And I'm going to show you guys some tools that I use. It'll probably also be included in the document that Dan hands out to everybody with all of the racks and things that you guys can use after this weekend. And yeah, I think one point that I kind of want to nail in is like, it just takes a lot of time and a lot of repetition to get good at anything. It doesn't really matter if it's music or not. There's a quote that I'll share by the end of the project that has stuck with me for the last like 10 years that touches on this. But just do a lot of work, like just do a huge volume of work. It's kind of like what Rob was saying. It's like you kind of have to sift through 10, 15, 20, however many projects. And for every one of those, you'll get maybe 2, 3 good ideas that you can run with. And ultimately, all of this is to help you kind of save your time and energy. So, general overview. Obviously, some of these things are like very rudimentary. A good mix is not just like an isolated element that like brings the entire thing to completion. It's like some of its parts, they're all going to work together in different ways. And I think another thing when it comes to like sample selection and sound design is like you always hear, oh, you got to have good samples. You got to make sure that you're starting with quality sounds, which is very true. But I think taking the context of the samples you're picking is like an important note, because you could hear, a really degraded sample that might be like, ripped from another recording, kind of like what Rob was messing with on the push yesterday, that kind of like vintagey feel. And like you'll have like a kind of like lo-fi snare where in the context of like a really high fidelity mix, you'd be like, it sounds weird. But then you could take that same sample and depending on like what that's all structured around, that could be the exact snare that you need in the context of whatever it is you're making. But I'm also going to be touching on like the template that I use, which again, the template that I use is not necessary for you to take the principles I'm talking about and like integrate it into what you do. And like Dan was talking about yesterday, I also kind of do like a bus limiting situation because I tend to make music that is intended for like a dance floor or like a club setting where it's like, I want this thing to punch, I want it to have impact, and I want it to be like competitively loud with other songs that I might be mixing. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about that later. But yeah, like I was just talking about, sample selection and sound design, context, super important. And if you're like running into these issues where you're not quite sure how to get two things to work together, one of those things probably doesn't need to be there or could be arranged differently. Like the melodic choices that you're making could like better complement the song. So just kind of like taking a second to step back and reevaluate like where are these sitting in the entire frequency spectrum? Are they overlapping like crazy? Because you could soothe and carve like crazy if you want to, but sometimes you just need to take things out. These are a couple just like analogies that I think of when like envisioning a mix. And can you see the three-dimensional cube thing up there? So this was a way that this was described to me that like made sense. I can be kind of a visual learner, but you've got your cube thing here, and this is your sound stage, your mix room, whatever you want to call it. And when you are done with structuring out your whole track, like you've told yourself, okay, there's nothing else that I want to add to this. I just want to polish what I've got. You can kind of think of it this way. Like I've got everything existing in here. Your axis right here, up and down, is going to be like your frequency spectrum. So like your high frequencies are going to live up here, low frequencies down here, and then left to right, you've got the stereo field. And then forward and backward, you've got your depth and your time-based effects, things like reverb and delay, things that are going to make it seem more forward or backward in a mix. And it's just like a nice stepping stone at the beginning of the process so that you can be like, all right, where are all of these elements existing? Like, and you can kind of go down the mental checklist. Another way that you could imagine it is like, depending on like the volume of whatever's going on, that's going to be, imagine there's like little orbs in here, little circles, and every one of your elements might be a different size depending on like how loud it is or how much space it's actually occupying in here. So like your hi-hats might be a little smaller than what your, sub frequencies look like. And you might have your hi-hats kind of like dispersed out through here, and your sub and your kick and things that you typically want to keep in mono are going to be chilling along the center line. And so after you kind of like get that general overview of, all right, where do I want things to sit? You're going to go through, you're going to set levels for everything, and this is going to be also dependent on like the genre that you're working in, of like what elements you're going to prioritize and how they're going to sit in relation to one another. With this like bus limiting setup, you can mix pretty hot. And like Dan was talking about, when it's going into these like clippers and limiters in this series, you're going to be shaving off some of those really dynamic peaks that just end up unpleasant in the like overall like end result of the song. And I'm just going to go ahead and play this song and sort of dive into some of the elements. I might return back to this slide, but I think it's going to make more sense what I'm talking about to just see it in context, so I kind of want to just get into it. But yeah, let's go ahead and just give this a listen really quick. This will probably wake everybody up if they're not already awake.
We're going to want to keep that.
I'm going to take this thing out. I was going to use it as an example of reverbs, but I'll get to that later. Here we go. Oh, yeah.
We're gonna want to keep that.
Very subtle subliminal messaging. I'm saying something backwards. You'll just have to go home and reverse it if you want to know what I'm saying. But that's an idea of like what I do in my general wheelhouse. It's like kind of trying to combine, you know, these aggressive sounds with these also very like lush, beautiful sounds. I have an affinity for those things, and I do my best to really combine them in a way that it doesn't feel too, you know, disjointed. But yeah, I was kind of touching on, it's like I'm trying to find this balance between what is a loud mix and master, but still a dynamic mix and master. Because I think, especially in the dance music world, you'll kind of run into just, I mean, everybody's seen the waveform that is just a sausage, and it's just a brick wall, which, like, all the power to the brick wall homies out there. But I'm trying to meet it somewhere in the middle, because I just personally like the dynamics, but there is, like, the consideration of having this, be loud against other songs that you would be mixing it with in a live setting. And so I think that the bus limiting setup is like just one of the ways through the process you can kind of ensure that you'll get that loudness, but also clarity. And you could like abuse that system, not really like abuse, but like you could push it in like a more heavy-handed direction if you want. But I'm gonna go ahead and get into just some of like the nuts and bolts of like how I'm processing certain things, particularly with like reverbs and setting space for like the drums. So I'll play those just on their own in this drop section. Also, I have no idea what it sounds like on that side of the... Okay, cool. Cool. But yeah, I'm just gonna play these drums in solo really quick. Really simple. Like, it's just kind of holding it down while everything else in this main group is doing what it does. I'll get into my thought process behind like having everything in its own group later, but I don't want to get too sidetracked from the drums. That's my goal here. So kick, very minimal processing. I have a little bit of this transient shaper on. It's doing, let's see, 7%, increasing the attack. And I love this kilohertz transient shaper. You can have it be like a little more transparent as it is here, or also really heavy-handed. But honestly, I find I never need to put this thing over like 15% to get a little bit more attack on some of my drums as I need it. And then to just pull the sustain back a little bit. This kick sample is already like pretty clipped. It's like, I'll zoom in and you can see. But I just wanted to bring it in a little bit with the transient shaper, because for a lot of dance music, like you don't need as much of a tail on your kick when you're like trying to do something that's a little more tight like this. Obviously there are different types of house and whatnot where like the kick itself is a large portion of your sub frequencies. But in this case, I wanted it a little tighter. And then I always have these reverse kicks, and I put them on their own channel just because I want to be able to control the level of those independently of the other one. I used to do it all in one and just go into the clip itself and bring down the gain. But for me, like just visually, it helps for me to have things like all in their own lanes, which can get really messy. But if that's something that works for you, like by all means do it, because like when you are going in and organizing your project, you want just like whatever's going to visually work for you. And I've found that, it's pretty different for everyone. I've got this other kick hanging out that's in the verse sections. And I typically don't have like more than one kick, but I just really liked the way that this one felt in the context of like the build-ups and the verse sections. And yeah, so like kind of with the sample selection thing, it's like find a kick that you love from the get-go so that you don't have to do much of anything to it. There's so many good samples out there between Splice and between artists that you already like that have put out material for you. Like, go find it and go use it. I mean, I would be hard-pressed to think that if you got someone's sample pack, like if you make a track with that and that's your inspiration for the day, it's like, it's not going to sound like that artist. I guarantee it. Like, anytime I've tried to emulate something for learning purposes, it always turned into some version of what I thought that was going to be that still ended up feeling like it was mine. And I like always end up learning something new. But yeah, I'm just rolling these off up to 40. And then we've got a clipper. I use K-Clip a majority of the time. There's a lot of other great ones like Standard Clip, Gold Clip. I know that you saw Standard Clip in Dan's presentation. But these, again, not really doing anything. It's just like, it's almost like, it's like a safety blanket for these frequencies. It's like, if for whatever reason there is buildup between a lot of things that are playing at once, it's just kind of guaranteeing that it's not going to be crossing over that 0 dB threshold. And I also want to say that if you want to learn more about this kind of like bus limiting technique, there's this method. So I'm kind of combining two methods. There's this one that's called clip to zero, and there's a channel on YouTube by this artist that goes by, I think it's like Baphometrics or Baphometrics, and they go into like excruciating detail behind like the science of how this setup works. But ultimately, it is just the concept of taking your individual elements and saturating them, or like, you know, making them harmonically rich enough to get to that point where they could be running into a clipper, and then strategically clipping so that you're getting just maximum loudness. So it's a combination between that method and the like serial limiting method. And this template I actually got from another producer that goes by Ahi, and he does also educational videos for bass music and the like. Hello. And I would also recommend checking out his material as well, because he kind of talks about how everything with these clippers and limiters are being routed. You can see like my kick and my snare and all my drums are going through these two separate pre-masters that are just, they also just have a limiter on them, but they're, let's see here. Each of the elements that are like in these groups are strategically routed to either this first limiter or the second limiter, so that those limiters independently can handle different groups of material. So like, I didn't do it for this track, but you can see on this vocal, it's going straight out the master, because like I don't want it to hit either of those limiters. I want it to be really dynamic. I want it to sit on top of everything else that might be compressed. Again, I didn't use this bass subgroup, and I'll get into that later. But this one would be going through this first chain, so it would be getting processed through the same limiter that the kick and the snare are. And so those things are going to have a little bit more glue while like in together, and then everything else will be going through this other limiter that's handling it. And like having limiters handle your signal in stages, it's kind of like, say you have really dynamic signal here, going through one limiter, chopping off some of those peaks, and then it's like, and then collectively it's kind of raising up that signal, where then if it runs into the other limiter, you know, that collective signal, it's getting some of those transient peaks shaved off, and it's doing it little by little so that one limiter doesn't have to work as hard. But let's get back into these drums.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Why route them through those tracks and not put the limiter on a return track?
I think, I mean, if you wanted to, you probably could do it. Visually, for me, this just like made a little bit more sense. But I think that if you wanted to do it that way, you could. But I think you mean like just start sending the groups to a return track as a
Put the limiter on it?
the,
Get you the same result.
I haven't experimented with it personally, so I don't know if it would like produce the exact same result or not. But I think, you know, it could probably work in theory. I've just never tried it. I found that this was like visually a way for me to kind of continue to keep track of it.
Wouldn't it be in parallel if you didn't do return tracks, unless you did it pre-fader and then turn the original tracks all the way down?
The original tracks could be in send only.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Then again, you're routed now, and it's almost extra steps.
yeah. So like,
Yeah, yeah, and you only
Yeah,
get so
there's
many,
a,
too.
if you've been heard of Warp Academy, there's a template that the guy that runs that just ran out.
Uh-huh.
And it's really cool to see how he does it, but it's pretty complicated, because he has separate actual audio tracks that he routes things to.
yeah.
And then make them like a bus.
Yeah, there are definitely like iterations of this template that could go a little deeper. I tend to keep things like, for my own sake, like as basic as I can while still accomplishing the goal. Just because like I would say I came into all of this as really like a songwriter and just like wanting to make songs that I resonate with first, and then I became, you know, more of like an engineer and sound designer, and anything else definitely second. Like all of those things were just a means to an end to be able to get out ideas that I, you know, had like in me. And so that was kind of like, this is all, you know, just the result of me chasing the ideas, really, as opposed to like coming in as a sound designer or an engineer that decided, oh, I have, you know, something that I want to express and get out there. Let's see. All right, kicks. All right, snares. I have, I guess now that we're on to returns, I really only have these 4 in every project. I don't know if you can see them, but I've got a tight reverb, which is like super, super tight. Like normally never more than like a second. And that's just like a really quick reflection for transient drums. And then after that, I have a room that's just a tiny bit bigger. Yeah, it's like almost exactly twice as big. And then a hall, and that's just going to be for the elements that I really want to have that like depth and width in the mix. And then I have this extra. And there are a lot of projects where I don't even end up using this one, but it really is like if I just want, it's almost more of like a sound designy reverb because it's so big. But I love Valhalla Shimmer. There's a lot of cool things you can do with like the reflections and like all of these different reverb modes, and it kind of does what it sounds like it's gonna do. It's like just a very kind of like lush and pristine reverb. You could also tell I'm like just a big Valhalla fan. They make great reverb plugins. They're all really affordable and they sound great. A lot of people will use Vintage Verb, which I've heard great things about. I've seen people get great results from those, but I am really used to Room. And then I have the reverb itself side-chained to my kick and my snare. And that, again, is going to make a huge difference in, like, if you are sending a lot of things through these reverbs, like, all of those tails can just build up together and create more mud, like, across the entire frequency spectrum, but, like, especially, you know, in like, your mid-range area. And so you want to kind of side chain those out with your kick and snare to give those more presence in the mix. And then I give it just this little bit of EQ, just rolling off some of the lows and not totally cutting out the highs, because I think a lot of times people will completely cut out the highs or even the lows in a lot of cases of some of their elements. And I think that based on what you're dealing with, you kind of want to go at it in a case-by-case basis, because sometimes you could be really taking out a lot of warmth from a signal if you're completely cutting it out. And I think a lot of times it could just do like a shelf as opposed to, that's not what I wanted, like a shelf as opposed to you know, a full-on cut. But that's one of those things where you just want to like think, what space is this occupying, and like, do I really need to cut out everything, or can I just shelf off some of it? Obviously, if there is a lot of sub-frequencies in it, you want to like take those out so that you have room for your dedicated sub or 808 or whatever it might be. So all of my snares and my top drums are all to varying degrees going to be sent to either this tight verb or this room verb. In some cases, it might be the hall verb as well, but it's normally between those two. And all of this is just an effort of putting the drums in their own similar space. Like when you're sourcing samples from different corners of Splice or just different packs, you know, they're all processed in their own like unique ways. So whenever you're bringing it into your track, like you want them to all kind of like live together and feel more cohesive. And this was one thing that like really kind of helped me level up my drums and get them more to that place. So let's see if we can kind of just hear it in isolation. We've got this snare. It's really subtle, like, but if I take off these sends, it's definitely just 100% dry. And then the combination of giving all of these just a little bit is gonna gel them together a little bit. As opposed to if they're all dry. And let's see, should probably give these their reverb back. And I also want to note that like this is the most organized project of mine that you're ever gonna see. I did it on purpose before this presentation because I was like, all right, I need to be able to know where everything is. But normally by the time I'm mixing something down, it is like all over the freaking place. But what I would do is typically is like bounce everything to audio before I'm really gonna go in for a mix session. And I'm like just a huge audio person. Like I will work in audio unless I can't most of the time. And when I'm programming certain hi-hats, or like you can see with these build snares, I will do those in MIDI, and I didn't end up bouncing those because I just felt like I had enough control with it in MIDI already. There's not like a bunch of tails that I want to chop to clear space for other things, so I kind of left it as is. But I think that's really the biggest thing that, you know, helps get cohesion in the drums for me. Let's listen to just the drums of the second drop in isolation, just because it's got a little bit different of a vibe going on. And I want to see if there's anything on there that I need to touch on. One thing that I do want to touch on, just because like I feel like this is pretty consistent across most tunes that I make, is like sometimes you'll be starting with your drums and you'll lay out an entire loop, but it's definitely important to kind of go back as you start filling in more elements of the song and just see where you can kind of create gaps in your drum groove to give that push and pull. Because you always kind of want something, I don't know if it was Rob that mentioned it, but like the push and pull and keeping that in mind is like super important, especially when it comes to like these more like ADD styles of dance music, where like when I first started producing, somebody gave me this idea. They were like, something should be changing every 8 bars. I feel like that's a little bit too much of like a prescription for how to be creative for me, but like it is something to keep in mind, where it's like something interesting should be coming into play every 8 bars or so, but I don't think that it needs to be like, I think that you can balance conventions with creativity. So if you find an idea that's working well and it's not doing that per se, there's nothing, you know, inherently wrong with that. You kind of have to like develop an intuition of like, does this need something? If so, what does it need, and where is it going to occupy? Let's see. I already kind of talked about loudness versus dynamics a little bit. I know Rob also kind of touched on just like contrast and like having transient material versus non-transient material. Because if you have a song where it's like all one or the other, there's no contrast at all. It's kind of like, I think about it in the context of like a DJ set, where if you go to see somebody and from minute 1 to minute 60, they're playing like just like earth-shaking bangers. By the end, you're just like satiated. It all just kind of feels like the climax of a movie for an hour, when like you have no like buy-in or investment in like what it took to get to that point. And you can kind of think of a mix in the same way, where it's like, if everything is, you know, on 10 balls to the wall, then nothing is on 10 balls to the wall. And so that's how I go about trying to like mix these like more lush elements with more of the aggressive stuff. It's like, I feel like it can make the aggressive stuff feel more impactful by the time it actually comes in. I want to see. So the reason that I have everything in this main group as opposed to like my sub frequencies in this bass and subgroup and the any of the vocals that are going on in here, I just liked how they glued together going through. I have really subtle tape saturation going on through Isotope Trash, great distortion plugin, but this is like the most basic way that you could use this thing. There's stuff going on in here that I couldn't even tell you what is happening. But it's just tape saturation on 10% on this mix, just to gel everything together a little bit. And I liked how it sounded to have everything kind of going through the clipper and the limiter at the end of this group together. 'Cause I think when it's all getting processed together like that, it really does sort of like gel it. Whereas, you know, sometimes when you have it separated like this, I think I could just hear a distinction between like the layers and where they were existing in the soundstage. And it felt like bass, hard line, main elements, hard line, drums that's kind of like chilling in there. But like having it in the main group made it all kind of feel like it was, I mean, quite literally compressed together in a pleasant way. And I have this, have you guys seen this Endless Smile plugin before? So there are like plenty of like, you know, one knob do the job things. And it's kind of like what Rob was showing with his pre-drop diminisher. This thing is hilarious. And it's really subtle on the group, and it's just to kind of add movement. And you can see in these 2 points, it's only going up, to 0.1, and it's at the very end of a build. But whenever so you have all of these different options, and they're all just combinations of reverbs, delays, and time-based effects that will like help you build tension. And the more you increase the intensity, the crazier this little guy gets. And I'll just show you what it's doing. And having these little touches, especially like in build-ups, to emphasize the drop, I think like it just builds more tension. So solo this. Let's make it really exaggerated just so you can kind of see what it's doing. So yeah, that one is like a combination of like a high pass, some reverb. But I'll do just little things like that throughout the entire process that at the end kind of add up to like an overall just like more dynamic mix.
I was gonna say there's a Max for Live version. Somebody remade Endless Smile. It's called Endless Smile by AJ Audio. It's a pretty Max for Live version.
Nice. Yeah, and I know Bass Clef had one that was really popular for some time. It was like Bass Clef's Easy Washout.
Easy Washout.
Yeah, yeah. And it's essentially the same thing. And having little tools like that are really quick to do as opposed to like, bringing in auto filter and automating up the dry wet of a reverb, just make the process easier for you. Let's see. I guess just more mental checklist as I'm going through a mix. Like, let's say this is all structured out and I haven't really touched much of anything. I would go in and make sure that like I have these kinds of transitions and different types of automation where I want them. So like one thing I've been doing a lot lately to kind of like indicate to listeners like, okay, something is about to change. This is also kind of like DJ mentality where like I'm gonna have this filter starting to like either open or close based on where it's at. Here, that one was. And these little subtle things like are, whether someone would acknowledge it or not, giving people and listeners like the indication, okay, like we're moving into something else. Another thing that I didn't touch on for like these top drums, because a lot of these sounds and hi-hats were really clean, and they still like are after the fact, but I added a little bit of a distortion. I love this Rift plugin. It's only on 8%, but that is another thing that like in tandem with the reverbs is kind of gluing these things together into their own space, giving them like a little bit more character, a little bit more texture than what they would if I was just dragging these things in raw. I've got a little bit of soothe on the hi-hats, and I think it's literally just a tame hi-hat preset. And what this is a dynamic resonant like tamer. It can do a lot of things, but that's its primary use. You also kind of want to be careful with this because you can like soothe the life out of things. So you just want to be mindful when you're using it. There's also a Max for Live device that if you want something like this, I think it's free. It's called Boba. And it, is virtually the same effect. It's like a resonant peak tamer.
Virtual Riot also on his Patreon has We Have Plugins at Home Mom series. Versions remade Soothe and Disperser and a bunch of other cool stuff. It's on his Patreon. It's really cool.
Yeah, definitely check that out. And he's also just like an incredible resource in general. Disperser is like an all-pass filter, which if you want to make like a, I don't know what you'd call it, like a moonshiner's disperser, you could just layer a bunch of EQ3s, like 10 to 20 EQ3s, and it's going to recreate that effect. But yeah, so that distortion, saturation, the soothe, we've got the filter that's kind of moving it along. All of those are going through the clipper and the limiter as well. I go back and forth between doing, compression or sidechain compression with an actual compressor versus like shaper box, but lately I've been doing more shaper box because again, you can get in here and be really surgical with like, when the signal is going to be coming back up after your kick. But I definitely want to look into that GM Audio Ducker because this thing can be a little just like tweaky when you're drawing in these LFO shapes. But I would highly recommend it. It's kind of a newer thing for me in my process because for the longest time I was just doing your standard compressor because it was like quick and easy and I already had it set up. And I just have this sidechain trigger group up here. And I don't always sidechain to the snare, but in the case of this song, I did want that transient to like really like cut through everything else that was going on. So I just have those coming in on the drop sections. And then obviously on the kick as well. Let's see here. Automations, talked about stereo field. I will bounce everything to audio. Oh, thanks for sharing. So I've got, let's see, this donk. Which, fantastic, Serum, love it. I was actually really proud of this patch. A lot of times I'll use presets, but for this one I was like, I'm gonna make a donk. And I made a donk. And you can see the MIDI stretched out to here, and it would, you know, kind of like the decay would extend out to where this snare is hitting, or where the snare, like where the kick is going right there. And I bounce everything down and get really surgical by the end, because like sometimes whether you can see it or know it or not, there are going to be residual tails on like the elements of your mix. And like this is where like the intuition part comes into play, because even if you can, you know, go in and cut everything down to like the millisecond of where you want it to end, there are certain things that like if you get too clinical with it, it's going to start to sound like overproduced and unnatural. But I think like having things in audio at the bare minimum is giving you just like much more awareness of not only like what the elements in your mix look like, but like how long they're ringing out and what they could possibly be kind of like interrupting with. So yeah, I've gone through and pretty meticulously chopped all of these things that, you know, had their own independent reverbs. Like these vocal samples would be ringing out for a lot longer if I hadn't chopped them. That's also an Easter egg, because I sampled the vocal from like another old song of mine, but it's kind of subtle, so you wouldn't know it unless you have been paying attention for a long time. I've got just the effects bus. I always tend to put this a bit warmer saturator on here. And normally I think it's set at like 6 dB and 60%, but even that is a little heavy-handed. I just bring it down to 2 and the dry wet to 40. But yeah, I would definitely recommend at the very least bouncing the audio and not always chopping every single tail, but like just to be aware of like what everything truly looks like. And then let's see. Let's say we've got everything kind of like where we want it to be. Rob also mentioned references, which I have not been like very good about this in the past. Like I just recently started using more references to get an idea of like where different things are sitting in the mix. And I would highly recommend it at this point, because I feel like it's like noticeably improved the quality of my mix downs and given me like a target to shoot for. I think a lot of people, when it's like they've completed the tune, they're like, where do I start? And I think one way that like I was looking into recently was, let's just bring like a sub into here. So you want to find like an anchor point that, oh, that is not what I was looking for. There we go. You want an anchor point to kind of start the mix from, and I think drums are a really solid place for that. But then you're like, okay, cool, I can start mixing around my kick, but where do I actually want it to like sit level-wise? And there's not like hard rules around that, but like with a lot of the references that I was looking at when you went to the overall mix, their sub was hitting somewhere between like -8, -6. And if you want to get an idea of like how to actually monitor that, you can take a spectrum and if you go down here and then go to the range, it's set from 0 to 120, but you could put this to like -10. So it's going to own in on like this range of decibels. And let's see here. So like that's pretty hot. I would probably, if I was going to be starting from this, bring it down so it's getting to around that like -6 mark. And again, like, this is not a prescription. This is not like if you want to make music, you need to make sure that your sub is hitting -6. It's just an approach to kind of get you started, where like you can go and look at your mix and see where relative to these other things is the sub hitting in my track. And then you can use that as a reference point to like kind of like mix all of your other sounds around. So that is one way that you could go about it. But otherwise, I would probably start basing it off of like kick snare. Let's see. How much time do I have left here?
Maybe like 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. I'll get into what I've got going on my master. I always have this pre-master chain, and again, it's doing, let's see what this endless smile is doing versus the other one. Okay, it's really just washing out the end. So like, these are not always going to be, these are not really doing anything incredibly noticeable in the tune. I've got that's washing out the end. I've got this Pro Q that's scooping out a little bit of the side information. This mid-side EQ, it's like any of the frequencies that are like isolated to the sides that are like below that about 200 hertz mark. I don't typically want, because I want to preserve all of my side information for like frequency content that's kind of existing above that. And that's like the main extent of like mid-side EQ that I do in a majority of my tracks. It's one of those like things where I feel like when I first started producing, I was like, man, I'm never going to be good until I figure out how mid-side EQ works. And like, it could not be further from the truth. It's definitely worth like paying attention to, and like, you know, you want to brush up on things that like you're not completely like comprehending, which like, you know, there's obviously a handful that any of us could always be learning at any given point. But like, this is more just like a security measure, because what I do know is that like the more side information that you have building up down in this area, the more kind of that like muddy sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? It just gets like a little warbly down in those sections of your mix if you're not kind of treating that information and or getting rid of it. This is just putting everything underneath 130 in mono. Again, I just want it to be able to translate well onto a bigger system. I actually have, I think, the soothes that I have on here undone, because when you have them processing all of this information, it can go crazy on your CPU. So for the sake of the presentation, I had them off. But these are also like really subtle. And it's really just sort of treating some of these areas in like the 8K region where you can get some of those harsh resonances building up. I don't think that I have a particularly sensitive ear, but I feel like it's sensitive enough to where like a lot of times I feel like I'm kind of having to go back into hi-hats and different bass sounds and make sure that like I'm taming some of those resonances, because the louder that you're mixing, the more those types of things are going to be standing out. And so it's like, yes, I'm kind of like mixing ignorantly in a way here, but also like there is still mixing to be done. I think with a lot of the like clipping and limiting, people think, oh, I'm just going to leave literally everything at 0. It's like, no, all of these tracks still have their own like dynamics and things going on that need to be like paid attention to. You'll see that I don't have everything on this mastering chain, and it's just because like this is always like an iterative process where I might not be using the same thing that I did in the last tune, and so, or I might be A/Bing different options. Like I was kind of experimenting, like, what if I set a clipper again before I did all of my master bus processing, so that like all of these other plugins that are going to be expanding the tune don't have to work as hard themselves. But I just didn't find it to sound as good as just having my typical clipper limiter at the end of this chain. I've got a little bit of multiband on both of these, but it's really subtle, 15%. This vintage finalizer, this is just kind of adding a little bit of compression to the overall mix. And I think that this is probably still a preset that you could find in 12 as well. I didn't even touch on the fact that I'm in 10 still, so please don't kill me. And again, this is giving it like some color. I'll kind of A/B with it on off. Again, super subtle. But I had in some other tunes, like some of these frequency ranges chopped out. Didn't want it for this one. Didn't want this one either. This one is just doing another little cut up in that 8K range because I was just getting a lot of nasty buildup in there. And then we've got our clipper into a limiter, into another limiter. And then this utility that's, I think, just bringing everything down at the end for a fade out. Let's see. I want to make sure if there's nothing else I've got in here. Andre's going to cover sound design, and I'm not going to lie, I'm like really looking forward to seeing what he's going to do because he's one of the craziest sound designers I know. And like, I think I want to show you this bass just because like this is me trying to be Andre for a moment. It's like these fill guys here.
He's grunting
Also, I want to touch on this reverb throw rack because these types of things, like when I was talking about with the push and pull, add a lot of that, where it's like I also have this other bass doing it as well. And if you have something like that at the end of every 8 bars or so, it's always going to be like, oh shit, here we go. And so I use that all of the time. This rack is just got a stock Ableton verb and the macros to the dry wet. And I also have this OTT kind of getting brought up with the dry wet as well because it kind of exaggerates the frequencies that are happening like in that reverb tail. I don't have this low cut going on. And then I also have these other things as options, like an auto pan that's giving some movement. And I don't do it every time, but like if I was to do it. And that is just another little like fun trick for adding movement to those tails. But what I was doing with this patch, and I think Andre's going to get into this, but like on a really like molecular level or whatever. But I have these LFO Max for Live devices just assigned to a bunch of random stuff in this serum patch. And it's a very basic serum patch. I think at its core, it's, yeah, just like it's just a harmonic series and some distortion, some flanger, and more multiband. And these distortion types are gonna like drastically affect like what type of bass you're getting. And so I have it, they call it a mud pie. I'll just record that and let it go for like a minute or something. And then I just chop the best bits. And that's like, one way that I think about music is like, you're not even necessarily a fan of like their music per se. You're just a fan of people's choices because now we're presented with so many options that like, anyone is capable of making like X or Y genre, but like the reason that you gravitate towards an artist is because you're like, I just like their particular set of choices. and it's also kind of like reassuring for you where it's like there's no wrong answers and perfection is completely subjective. And that's something that I have to remind myself all of the time because, you know, it can get hard out there for these creative people. You know what I mean? We put way too much pressure on ourselves, myself included. But I just wanted to show that fun sound design thing because like I was doing it in the spirit of artists like Copycat, Mr. Bill, all of these people that have just really, really crazy sound design. The last thing that I want to show before I get off of here, and I don't think that I could like sit in front of a group of people trying to like provide some type of knowledge without playing this, because I was shown this probably like 10 years ago, and it's still stuck with me. But who has heard the quote about the creative process by Ira Glass? Yeah.
I don't know which one.
It's probably the one, but he's a journalist, storyteller, radio personality, and so I guess I'm just gonna leave you guys with this one because it kind of touches on what I was talking about at the beginning, where it's like, you know, he says it way better than I could. I'm just gonna let him do it.
Nobody tells people who are beginners, and I really wish somebody had told this to me, is that all of us who do creative work, like, you know, we get into it, and we get into it because we have good taste. But it's like there's a gap, that for the first couple of years that you're making stuff, what you're making isn't so good, okay? It's not that great. It's trying to be good. It has ambition to be good, but it's not quite that good. But your taste, the thing that got you into the game, your taste is still killer. And your taste is good enough that you can tell that what you're making is kind of a disappointment to you. You know what I mean? A lot of people never get past that phase. A lot of people at that point, they quit. And the thing I would just like say to you with all my heart is that most everybody I know who does interesting creative work, they went through a phase of years where they had really good taste, they could tell what they were making wasn't as good as they wanted it to be. They knew it felt short. It didn't have this special thing that we wanted it to have. And the thing I would say to you is everybody goes through that. And for you to go through it, if you're going through it right now, if you're just getting out of that phase, you gotta know it's totally normal. And the most important possible thing you could do is do a lot of work. Do a huge volume of work. Put yourself on a deadline so that every week or every month you know you're going to finish one story. Because it's only by actually going through a volume of work that you're actually going to catch up and close that gap. And the work you're making will be as good as your ambitions. In my case, like I took longer to figure out how to do this than anybody I've ever met. It takes a while. It's going to take you a while. It's normal to take a while, and you just have to fight your way through that. Okay?
That's good.
Yeah. So thank you guys.